Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the way the full book of Psalms is designed and structured. As I said, as the Psalm book as it currently exists was almost certainly the last Old Testament book to be finished. And it's compiled of 150 different kinds of songs, 150 different songs. Now, different ancient versions of the manuscripts number these psalms slightly differently. You have the old Hebrew versions and the old Greek versions, and some of the psalms were split up and separated or maybe combined into one in ways that make the numbering system slightly different. I'm just going to follow the numbering system as printed in my English Bible, a copy of the New International Version. I am not nearly qualified to explain like all the intricacies of how we know like which psalms were separated and combined. But they have both versions, both the Greek and Hebrew versions of the Psalms have 150 Psalms in them, so that number is set at least. They would have been edited and combined into this book by somebody or some group of people fairly late in Israelite history, again, probably after 400 BC, when they came back to the land and were getting settled in the land again in the temple. And the Psalms, okay, so David would have started this off intending to create a hymnal for Israel to use in his worship service in his day, or after his day, actually. But the Psalm book, and most of his content is in the first two parts of the Psalms. But it grew on, obviously, much beyond his day. He lived in around 1000 BC. The Psalm book was probably finished around 400 or something thereafter BC, so about 600 years later. So there's about 600 years more development of the Psalms after David's death. And they were finally taken and compiled in this form, and they were edited into 5 distinct units, or books, as we call them, of Psalms, which were probably done in the style of the 5 books of Moses, Genesis and Deuteronomy. You have the 5 books of the Psalms, and these clusters or categories of Psalms that go from Psalm 1 to Psalm, I think, 41 is book 1, and going down to the end. And you can, and we'll note where the books begin and end as we go through them. And this tells the story. And here's the thing about the Psalms that's really interesting. Each Psalm is, of course, an individual psalm, and they have their individual meanings and they have their individual types. Okay. But they all, and we'll talk about the types in a little bit, but they also fit into a larger fabric, a larger tapestry of a story from beginning to end of Psalms. Like the Psalms, each individual psalm. You ever seen those mosaics of people where you take like photos, photos of faces or whatever, and they arrange them, and when you arrange them in a certain way based on the way the colors are laid out, it like forms a greater picture. It's like you have a picture that looks like someone's face made up of a bunch of different smaller photos that are arranged in such a way individually to make it look like they come together to form a greater picture. That's what the Psalms basically are. Each Psalm is itself a complete psalm and communicates a complete thought. But they also are all joined together and they're woven together in this larger tapestry to make the Psalm book, the Psalter, which tells a grander story from beginning to end. And it basically tells the story of Israelite history from beginning to end in its own, unique way. It starts off by presenting, in a similar way to what the book of Proverbs does, by presenting the singer or the reader, the speaker, with 2 choices. Either the choice of wisdom or the choice of folly, the choice of life or the choice of death. Very similar to the Proverbs. That's what the wisdom literature basically comes down to, is presenting these 2 choices. And inviting the reader to make the right choice, and warning the reader about what happens if he makes the wrong choice. And the rest of the Psalms basically unfold in a way that tells the story of Israel making their own choice, going into exile and coming back again, and then being restored to the graces of God, and then looking towards the future as the book of Psalms ends, to God's arrival as king. The book of Psalms is very kingly focused. So there's a lot of the focus on, it's associated with David, and David is talking about himself and his dynasty, and of course the person who ultimately ends up fulfilling that dynasty is Jesus Christ, who is the son of David, who becomes Israel's permanent king. That's what the New Testament's about. So that's what sets up the New Testament. So it's very messianic. The whole book is messianic. And it also tells the story of Israel's, decline and fall and rise again. And in the scope of doing so, all of creations decline and fall and rise again to be restored to God and praise the Lord. The individual songs fall into different kinds of categories. People out there have broken these down to pretty minute chunks, and I'm not smart enough or qualified enough to really give you a great breakdown of this. But there's, they call them, there's the lament psalms where the singer is like expressing mourning or lamentation over an individual or perhaps a community or national catastrophe. You have the songs of praise, which are basically just praising God. Then you have the royal songs, which are about the king. You have the messianic songs, which are about the anointed king to come, which becomes the Messiah. You have the imprecatory songs, which are about calling down curses on God, or asking God to call down curses on the psalmist's enemies. I look at it from the perspective of these are all parts of the Psalms. I don't really break the Psalms down into categories. I'm not qualified enough to do that. But I look at each of these elements as being material that can be contained in the Psalms. Not all Psalms contain all this kind of material, but they all contain, the Psalms as a whole, could contain any of this material. You could have wisdom, you could have instruction. A lot of it's about wisdom. A lot of it is about, like Proverbs, about wisdom. That's what they call Torah. Okay, Torah is a word that means instruction. Now we associate that mainly with the word that Moses gave, the law that Moses gave in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible. But it means, the word in a more general sense just means instruction. And so a lot of the songs are devoted to that. And then you have some laments, and you have some praise, and you have some other kinds of songs, these elements that are contained within the songs. I'm not going to break them down by type that much, but I will, I'm including this information so that we can be aware of these different kinds of elements that go into these songs. These are songs. Fundamentally, these are songs. They're meant to be sung. They're meant to be spoken aloud, and they're meant to be sung. Okay? Now, I'm not going to sing them. I am going to speak them. As I've said from the beginning of this video series until now, I'll continue saying it forever. The Word of God was meant to be spoken. It really was meant to be spoken aloud. It wasn't meant to be read quietly in a corner somewhere. It just wasn't. Okay? It was spoken first. All of God's revelation of mankind was originally spoken. The Word of God came to the prophets saying. Okay? And even the parts of it that ended up getting written down and preserved for future generations, which is what we have now in our Bibles today, even that was originally was written so that it could be spoken. Jeremiah wrote his stuff down so that Baruch could speak it out to the king. Okay, Moses wrote his law down so he could speak it out to the people. All right, Luke wrote down his account so that someone could speak it out to Theophilus. Everything in the Bible, all the written account, all the written revelation of God's Word. All the prophets wrote their stuff down so future generations could preserve it. So it could be preserved for future generations. And it was all meant to be spoken. It was originally spoken, it was spoken to begin with, and even after it was written, it was meant to be spoken aloud in front of a group of people. It was meant to be spoken aloud by someone trained in speaking it out loud. Okay? And the Psalms the same way. We saw Ezra and Nehemiah do that at the end of the Old Testament. We got done reading that. Psalms the same way. These are songs even. They're put to music, they're accompanied by instruments, and they're meant to be sung. There's a choir director who is meant to lead the singing somehow. Okay? Now, I'm not going to sing. I'm certainly not going to sing them with a choir. I'm not going to do that. But I will read them. Okay? I'll read them out loud. And that's how they're meant to be. That's how they're meant to be communicated. And they are emotional. They're songs, so they are emotional. And they're again, as I read them, I'm not really going to comment on them all that much because the meaning, to a large degree, the songs speak for themselves. They really do. When you read, again, each one is an individual unit by itself, and when you read through it, there's not usually a lot of ambiguity to what the Psalms mean. Now, some of the Psalms, a lot of them, will have their final fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And we'll get to that when we turn to the New Testament and see how the New Testament uses that. But I'm not going to flip ahead to the New Testament to show how the New Testament uses these Psalms as I read them. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to read the Psalms as they are, and that's the context in which we're going to take them. When we get to the New Testament, and we find these quotations or allusions of the Psalms, we can go back to the Psalms and look at the specific spots of the Psalms that the New Testament writers are quoting or alluding to, and get new insight in the Psalms that way. But I'm not going to go forward with it by going to the New Testament while I'm reading through the Psalms. I'm not going to do that. These are songs, and so they're meant to be sung. They're in poetry. They're songs written to be spun as in a kind of poetry. But it's ancient Hebrew poetry from 3,000 years ago. It's not English poetry. It's not the sort of poetry that we're used to. Okay? Now, this is a translation, obviously. It's English. It's not Hebrew. So you can't expect the songs to rhyme anyway because of the translation. But even in the original language, they did not rhyme. And they didn't have regular meter either. Hebrew poetry uses instead this concept called parallelism. And we've talked about this before. As we've been reading through the Old Testament, we've from the very beginning, we've noticed this tendency of the Hebrew writing style to revolve around this literary trademark called parallelism, which means you say basically two things, in some cases three things, but basically two things in parallel with each other. Okay, you say something, and then you either say it again, you say the same thing again, and emphasize it, or you say something and then you say it again, but then finish the thought with like a definitive ending, or you say something and then you say the opposite, or you say it backwards. That's parallelism. Okay, you're communicating your thoughts in these pairs of twos or maybe threes. This is actually an instance where our chapters and verses in our English Bibles are help, because for the most part, smart people of the past went through and numbered these psalm verses according to their lines of parallelism. So for the most part, as you read the Psalms, you'll be able to tell what sets of lines go together as parallels because of the way our verses are numbered. And that actually, I talked before about the chapters and verses not originally being part of the text, and not being inspired, and not being authoritative, and sometimes we pay more attention to those chapters and number breaks, verse breaks than we should. But in the case of the Psalms, it is a big help, because that does show us clearly where the lines are, or at least where the original, translators thought they were. And I'm going to be reading them accordingly. I'll be reading these songs in these pairs of lines, because that's what the parallelism is. You say a thing, and then you either say it again to emphasize the point, or you say it again but then add like a definitive flourish to end the thought, or you say it again, you say something and then you say it in backwards, or you say the opposite. You contrast it with something. That's Hebrew. All the Psalms are written that way, and we've been seeing this all throughout the Old Testament. The prophets spoke this way. All their poetry spoke this way. Whenever we write any Hebrew poetry, it's always written this way. And even their narrative is written this way. Even their narrative, we can see traces of it even in their narrative. Where they will say something and then either say it again, repeat themselves, or say the opposite to contrast. It's like we talk about how circular that is. Like in narrative speaking, when you talk like that, it sounds like you're speaking in circles. Because you'll say something, and then you'll say the same thing again, or you'll say it again but backwards, or you'll say the opposite, and like it's in our way of thinking, it's a very circular way of talking. But it was it infused every element of Hebrew society and thought, and so it's all over their literature. It's all, that's what the Psalms are. Okay, it's parallelism. That's all their poetry is, and even what their narrative is. Once you see it everywhere. Like, it's so different from what we think. We don't think this way. We don't think in circles. Okay, we think in lines. We like to go from start to finish. And, the Hebrews did in a way, okay, like this book from start to finish tells a story from Psalm 1 to Psalm 150. But it does that by spinning these circles all the way down this line. And we just don't think that way, do that. That's not the way our minds operate. That's not the way that Greek logic, Western logic, has formed over the centuries. And so we don't think this way, and so we have to be taught how to see it this way. But once we do see it, and again, I've been mentioning this since the beginning of this project, once you do see it, you start seeing it everywhere. I mean, it is everywhere in their writings. But you don't have rhyme. Of course, it's in translation anyway, so you wouldn't have rhyme regardless. And you don't have regular meter. And you also don't have another element of Hebrew poetry that we're completely going to miss because we're going to be reading it in an English translation, is this idea of using the alphabet system and lettering and numbering the song, or organizing the song around the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. That's what we call acrostic psalms, where each line starts with a successive letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Like in our language, it'd be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Like the first line would start with A, second line would start with B, and so on down the line. The Hebrew alphabet, of course, is different, but that's the idea. And of course, this being an English translation, we're going to completely miss that. So we're not going to get that all. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So whenever you see a psalm that has 22 verses, or a multiple of 22 verses, you can be pretty certain that that's going to be an acrostic psalm. Now, some acrostic psalms don't even use all 22 letters. So some acrostic psalms are actually shorter than 22 verses. But anytime you see a psalm that has 22 verses or a multiple of 22 verses, you can be completely confident that's an acrostic psalm in the original language. Psalm 119 is 176 psalms, and it actually has 8 verses that start with each of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. This is not really a big deal to us. Again, we're not reading it in Hebrew, so we're not going to see the effect of this anyway. This honestly is probably just because at the time these psalms were written, a lettered alphabet was still fairly new, and so it was a useful way of organizing thought content. It's probably, people today will likely tell you that it was intended as a memory aid. But you have to remember, ancient people had better memories than we do. They didn't need memory aid. You know, we go to sermons today. Now, my churches don't really do this. GAC, one of the churches I go to, used to do this, so they don't really anymore. Because I never have done this. Today, we have a lot of churches that like to have sermon outlines that have like creative acronyms or something like that to make memorization easier. So we think of acrostic psalms as being a memory aid tool, but honestly it really isn't, because ancient people had better memories than we do. Honestly, it's probably just because at that time, about 3,000 years ago, the idea of a lettered alphabet, an alphabet with letters instead of pictographs or symbols, was new. It was fairly new, and it was a useful organizing tool. And that's probably all there is to it. It's probably not any deeper than that. Anyway, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes because we're not going to get the effects of this either at all because we're not reading it in Hebrew. And so, and on top of that, we're not going to be getting any of the other Hebrew word effects, word plays, onomatopoeia, allusions, alliterations, puns, which of course we've been missing that all throughout the Old Testament, especially the poetry sections. So we're going to be missing it here too. It is literary, it is poetic, but it's in Hebrew, not in English. Hebrew from 3,000 years ago. And so it's not to our style, it's not in our language. And so we're going to miss that. We have to be aware of its existence, but we're going to miss it completely. We're going to miss the effects of it completely. Let me see here. There are some terms in the Psalms that are untranslated because we don't know what they mean. These are songs, and there are instructions in the book, in the Psalms, about how to sing them. You know, what melody to sing them to and what instruments to use and how to sing them. And so there are going to be some musical terms in here, notations, that are not translated, like Selah, one of the more common ones or well-known ones. And we don't know what they mean, okay? I will read these as I see them written here in the transliterated word, like Maskil or Selah or Megathoth or whatever they are. But I don't know what they mean. If the people have been studying Hebrew and English words for hundreds of years, don't know what they mean, I certainly don't know what they mean. So the meaning of some of these things has indeed been lost. Some of these terms and terminology are just gone, and we don't know what they mean anymore. Before I finish, I think there's one more point I want to make, and I think this is actually probably the most important point of all. I've been alluding to it several times throughout these two intro videos I've done, and I'm going to make it state it clearly. What really matters to us today about how to read and use and interpret the Psalms is based on how the New Testament uses it. Jesus and the apostles, how Jesus applied the Psalms to himself, and how the New Testament writers and the apostles and the first generation of the church applied the Psalms to Jesus. And that is how we need to think about the Psalms. But see, it's actually even deeper than that. A lot of the Psalms do have, there's about 50 Psalms, of the 150 in the book, there's about 50 of them that have no name attached to them. Which means 100 of them or so do. Whether or not those men were the actual authors, or they were simply written in their tradition or in their style. Like David, when you see David's name, the construction of the phrase in Hebrew doesn't necessarily mean he's the author. It just means it just connected to him in some way. And he probably did write most of those. But it could also mean that it's just a psalm about David or concerning David or important to David. And even that could maybe refer to his lineage as the king, the royal seed line, more so than the man himself. Okay. In the end, some of the Psalms are very biographical according to David's own life. Now again, I don't doubt that David himself did write most of these Psalms, and maybe even all of them. They have his name attached to them. But what really matters in the end is not whether or not David is speaking from his own experiences, because all of these things can be applied. The speaker of the Psalms is not limited to just being David or Asaph or whoever. Okay, when you see that word "I" in there, you could put yourself in that category of "I." The Psalms do reflect individual circumstances in these men's lives, wherever they are and wherever they were at their time in life. But these Psalms also can be applied to our circumstances as well. And we can see these Psalms, and we can see ourselves in the eye of the Psalms, just like David did. That's what they're for. Now, I'm not a singer. I'm not a song guy. Okay? For people who are immersed in the music world, this might not be strange or difficult to do, because music is kind of that way. I knew someone once who resonated very strongly with music. Music resonated with him. He was a choir guy. He was a music guy, and music spoke to him. He got the lyrics of songs. He found meaning in that, and he derived a lot of attachment to songs or a lot of significance out of. And I just don't. Okay, I am not a song guy. I am not a music guy. I'm not a very emotional guy. So it's hard for me. This series is hard for me in that regards. I was actually even thinking of not even doing the songs for that reason. This is an area of weakness for me. It's one of the reasons why I'm not going to teach it so much, or just read it. Okay? But you are supposed to identify with the speaker, whoever the speaker actually was, whoever the original speaker was, whoever the author was. In the end, isn't that important. The speaker of the Psalms is you as you speak the Psalms. And in a very profound way, the speaker of the Psalms actually becomes Jesus, because he spoke these Psalms. When he was growing up as a Jewish boy in the 1st century AD, he sang these songs. He applied these songs to himself. And he saw himself in these Psalms. He saw himself as a speaker in these Psalms. The New Testament also sees Jesus as the speaker of these Psalms. So in the end, Jesus becomes the speaker of the Psalms. One of the interesting things about the Psalms is that God himself doesn't speak in the Psalms. It's all about human response to God. This is the chance that God gives creation, his creation, mankind. This is the opportunity. This is a place where God gives man a chance to express himself to God. Without God himself saying, there's a couple of quotes of God in these Psalms. For the most part, God doesn't speak in these Psalms. This is all about humans speaking to God in whatever capacity they feel they need to at any given time. But in a very interesting way, God does become the speaker in the Psalms eventually, because Jesus speaks these Psalms. And in the long run, in the ultimate fulfillment of these Psalms, Jesus himself is the speaker of the Psalms. So when you read through these Psalms, keep in mind that the speaker of the Psalms Yes, it could be David. It could be Asaph. It could be Solomon or Moses or any other number of guys whose names are attached to them, or even the ones who have the Psalms that have no name attached, whoever that individual original author was. Okay? And it can be you, or me, as we apply these songs to ourselves and we sing these songs and we invest ourselves into the eye of the Psalms. But they also are ultimately Jesus, because he sung these songs and he applied them to himself. So he becomes ultimately our worship leader, singing these songs on our behalf in front of God. Even the Psalms, even the penitential Psalms, the Psalms of confessing sin, ultimately become Jesus' songs. Well, he himself committed no sins, but he became sin for us. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. Isaiah 50, the suffering servant prophecies in Isaiah, especially the ones in 51 and 52 of that book, say that the servant will take on the transgressor, be numbered with the transgressors, be numbered with the transgressors. So even though he himself committed no sins, he takes on our sin for us. So even in the penitential Psalms, he still speaks for us in that regard. So that is where I find ultimate meaning in the Psalms. I can sing these songs as myself, and I can also appreciate Jesus singing these songs on my behalf in front of God as my intercessor and as my worship leader. Okay, I think that's it for the intros. There might be some more background information to talk about as we go forward with this, but I'm pretty sure I've covered everything we need to cover in terms of getting us into the right information to appreciate the Psalms. Again, I'm not a Psalm guy. I'm not a music guy. I'm not an emotional guy. So this is a hard study for me. This is not. This is a section of scripture that I'm weak in. I'm not preaching or teaching from a position of strength here, because I'm not strong in this area. All right, so I'm just going to be recently reading these along, and you can read along with me or however you want to do, and I'll be explaining some things as we go. But for the most part, we're just going to be starting from Psalm 1, verse 1, and reading through to the end. However, I think I'll wait and get started with it next time, because I've already talked a lot. I've already had 2 20-plus minute videos, and I'm actually getting kind of hungry, and I need to eat. And so I think I will actually get started reading the Psalms next time. But those are my introductory thoughts to the Psalms. If I think of anything else that I wanted to mention, I think I've covered everything. I had a bunch of things I wanted to cover before we got started, and I think I've covered all that. But if I do think of anything else, I'll throw that in at the beginning of the next video, which I'll do Wednesday, I guess. I'm not going to be here tomorrow.